There was an awkward silence in the cafe that day. Jorge looked at his friends, his chest gripped by a terrible mix of shame and anger. He had just done something he couldn't easily erase. He humiliated his grandmother in front of everyone. He called her the lady with the broom, belittled her for working as a house cleaner when he dreamed of a bright future surrounded by success and respect. His friends laughed nervously, but Jorge felt something break inside him. He had never thought about the reasons that had pushed his grandmother to that job. He only saw her as an obstacle to his pride, a woman in an apron and rubber gloves who drew mockery from his circle. How could he admit that this woman was his family? For Jorge, the answer was simple: better to hide her. "Don't say she's my grandmother," he repeated disdainfully, while the words weighed on him more than any physical burden. But life has a strange way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. And what happened after that fateful afternoon not only changed his opinion, but marked him forever. Because behind that embarrassing grandmother, there was a secret even he couldn't have imagined. In the weeks that followed, Jorge avoided his grandmother's house. His friends kept mocking him, convinced that having someone in the family cleaning up trash was a reason for rejection. But an unexpected phone call broke that distance. His grandmother needed to talk to him. She didn't want reproaches or demands, just to tell him something that would turn everything Jorge thought he knew upside down. When he finally met her in the little apartment where she worked odd hours to make ends meet, there was a different look in her eyes. There was no resentment or sadness, but a serene strength that was unsettling. She asked him to listen without interrupting, to give her a chance to explain what had led her life to that point. She confessed that hard work was not a humiliation, but a choice with a clear purpose. While Jorge dreamed of future riches, she had faced a silent sacrifice, keeping him safe, covering expenses when his mother got sick, putting food on the table when there was no one else to help. Every house she cleaned was a battle won to ensure her family a decent future. That confession not only unsettled Jorge's mind, but struck him in the heart. She was not a defeated woman. She was an invisible warrior, someone who had borne the weight of the world without asking anything in return. And yet he had judged her for her job, for a facade that hid a gigantic soul. Everything began to change slowly after that day. Jorge began to see her with new eyes, to feel that painful mix of gratitude and regret. The wounded pride he felt before his friends turned into a deep commitment to honor the woman who had done so much and whose sacrifice he had never valued. But the most surprising twist was yet to come. One day, while organizing things in his grandmother's apartment, he found a drawer with letters and documents that revealed details he never would have imagined, from scholarships refused so she could work, to doctors who had visited his mother thanks to her, to hidden plans so Jorge could study abroad without ever losing touch with his family. Every written word, every saved receipt, every faded photo told the story of a woman who lived for others, and that beneath that cleaner's clothing, she carried the pride of having raised a family against all odds. Something inside Jorge shifted. It was not just regret, it was admiration, hope, a new desire to make amends. But before he could repair what was broken, another web of secrets came to light. An even deeper truth that showed him that getting to know his grandmother was only the first step. What else was this tireless woman hiding? What unimaginable sacrifices might she have made out of love for her family? And what would be the final lesson that would mark Jorge forever? The drama was just beginning, and what seemed like a simple episode of shame turned into a story of love, forgiveness, and discovery powerful enough to change lives. Jorge began to understand that real battles are not fought on the surface, but in the heart. His world was shaken, but he was ready to look beyond appearances, to face his own prejudices, and to let that woman, the humble cleaner he had despised, become his teacher and guide. Because that family, built on invisible sacrifices, had a message everyone needs to hear. And as Jorge walked toward this new truth, one question hung in the air: how many times do we judge without knowing the story behind? How many people whom we ignore are actually holding up with their strength what we take for granted? And you, who are hearing this story, what would you think if you discovered that someone you looked down upon had given more love and made more sacrifices than you ever imagined? That woman's diary, her hidden tears and her broken dreams, everything is about to be revealed. Don't move, because what happened next marked Jorge forever, and maybe you too. Next time you hear cleaner or humble job, remember this story, because things are not always what they seem. And in the next chapter, you will learn the full truth, the one that left Jorge breathless and changed his life. Are you ready to discover it? Because I assure you, you will never forget it. From the moment Pablo saw his grandmother cleaning the hallway that afternoon, he felt an electric mix of shame and simmering anger that he couldn't control. There she was, with her worn apron shielding her eyes from the sun, streaming through the window, holding an old broom as if it were a cane, and him, standing off to the side with his friends laughing and pointing mockingly. It wasn't just that his grandmother worked cleaning houses. It was that she did it in front of everyone, and it seemed to strip him of any value, any status. Then, without thinking, he let out that venomous phrase that cut through the room like a shot. Why do you always have to paint that job as something heroic? You're just the cleaner, the grandmother of dirty rags. A heavy silence, as if an invisible glass had shattered between them, filled the room. His grandmother lowered her gaze, shook her head slowly, and replied in a soft but firm voice, "Sometimes, being the cleaner is all we have left." Pablo felt his blood boil, and his friends burst out laughing, compounding his humiliation. He didn't think about how that little phrase, driven by ignorance and the fear of being judged, would open the door to a series of truths that would change his life forever. No one in the neighborhood, not even Pablo, really knew why she worked cleaning houses. Why would such a sweet and fragile woman carry years and years of hard work on her shoulders when they could live more comfortably? Why did she devote so many hours to tasks that seemed insignificant, almost degrading in her grandson's eyes? That was the mystery beginning to form in Pablo's mind, though he didn't know it yet. The story his grandmother hid behind those old gloves, and the broom was not an excuse, but a tremendous sacrifice he was completely blind to. But that blindness was about to be broken at a price he could never have imagined. The afternoon slipped into night. Pablo, heart still racing, decided to escape the mess he himself had created. He walked away with his friends, but something inside him weighed heavily. Why had he been so quick to humiliate someone who, of his own blood, was giving everything she had to keep the family afloat? The mocking smile faded from his face, replaced by a shadow of guilt. His grandmother's words, though gentle, echoed again and again in his head. Sometimes, being the cleaner is all we have left. That night, Pablo found himself in his room, staring at the ceiling without really seeing it. He tried to douse the flame of guilt with a common excuse. She's old and will rest soon. There are lives only meant to pass time until nothing's left. But just when he was about to sink into that fatalistic thought, something inside him rebelled. The memory of the strength with which his grandmother had held his gaze after his insult began to crack his coldness. He then wondered, without clear answers, how much she must know about struggle and sacrifice, things he simply couldn't comprehend. The next day, that uncomfortable curiosity began to haunt Pablo like a ghost that refused to let go. He decided to accompany his grandmother when she went to work, hiding behind the door of one of the apartments she cleaned. He wanted to see with his own eyes what she did, what that world, one he had always rejected, was really like. His friends would have burst out laughing if they'd seen him, unable to understand the mixture of fury and fascination he felt at the same time. But no one was there to judge him. It was just him and the truth. Then, with every movement his grandmother made, the story began to change shape. Pablo saw how she greeted everyone with respect, how that cleaning was her way of preserving the dignity of those who trusted her. She wasn't just another worker. She was the silent caretaker of homes that to others were just facades. As she picked up every piece of paper, cleaned every nook and cranny, she preserved something invisible but vital: trust, hope, and the love hidden behind the walls. And in an unexpected instant she paused, looked toward where Pablo was hiding, and with a melancholy smile seemed to say, "Someday you will understand." But the day did not end there. Pablo, increasingly captivated by this world that felt strange but fascinating, discovered something no one had ever told him. In an old folder hidden behind the fridge, he found papers he had never seen before. Documents that revealed his grandmother didn't just clean houses, but did it to keep her family afloat after her son, Pablo's father, had fallen into a deep addiction. That woman, whom he had mercilessly humiliated, had shouldered the burden of medical expenses, debts, and broken hopes alone for years. All while smiling and sweeping the dust away, suddenly the pieces started to fit together. Tears started to well up in his eyes as he understood that this supposed disgrace was nothing but an act of absolute bravery and sacrifice. His grandmother wasn't just cleaning houses. She was sweeping up the broken fragments of a family history he was only just beginning to glimpse. And in that mix of sadness and admiration, Pablo felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces for all he had ignored and destroyed with his words. Before leaving, his grandmother appeared in the doorway of the house she was cleaning. She said nothing, just looked at him with a mix of patience and deep love. Pablo lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. But in that silence, he understood that what he had seen was just the tip of the iceberg, that the story of this woman was far greater than his adolescent shame, that he had to change, and quickly, because time waits for no one. With the sense that something important was about to happen, Pablo walked away from the house with a question burning in his chest. What else had his grandmother hidden behind her apron and broom? What secrets could redeem such a great sacrifice? The answer, no doubt, would change forever the way he saw the woman he had humiliated in front of his friends, and also the way he saw himself. Because in that moment, he realized that some truths do not only make you fall, but are the first step toward standing back up again, toward believing once more in those who, without asking for anything in return, show you the true strength of love. Even in the humblest of places, that night, while the clock ticked on and the city slept, Pablo couldn't close his eyes. It was as if an age-old light had been lit inside him, revealing a path that had once been blocked by ignorance and prejudice. What happened next, no one could imagine, because away from being just the story of a boy ashamed of his grandmother, it was the story of an awakening, a brutal collision with reality that would shatter all his assumptions and mark him forever. And he knew, with a new and terrifying certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. Can you imagine living ashamed of someone as close as your own grandmother? That's exactly what happened to Marcos. He couldn't stand people knowing that his grandmother worked cleaning houses. For his friends, that was a shame he was not willing to admit. And the worst part was how he humiliated her in front of everyone, without realizing the harm his words could cause, without knowing that behind that ordinary job was a much deeper and more heartbreaking story, one that would soon change forever the way Marcos saw his grandmother. And himself, Marcos lived in a neighborhood where appearances were everything. Among classmates, colleagues, and acquaintances, being the child of someone who cleans houses was not something he wanted to share. That's why, when his friends asked what his family did for a living, he would lie or quickly change the subject. But there was one detail that few people knew and that Marcos always kept hidden: his grandmother Rosa. That quiet and hard-working woman who went out every morning with a cleaning cart was the reason their home stayed afloat. All he did was feel ashamed of her. One afternoon at the park, Marcos was with his friends. She arrived without knowing her grandson would be there, cleaning a bench where they would sit. Instead of greeting her kindly, Marcos raised his voice to correct her in front of everyone, ridiculing her, criticizing her. His friends laughed, reinforcing the humiliation, and Rosa simply lowered her head, saying nothing, just a look of sadness that Marcos saw as weakness. But in reality, hid a world of sacrifices. What drove Marcos to act that way? Why was his pride stronger than the love he should have had for his grandmother? But something was about to happen, something that would shake his world. Because Rosa was not just any woman, and that cleaning job was not the whole story. In fact, that truth that no one knew would unleash a series of revelations that would make Marcos suffer, learn, and, above all, change forever. When he got home that night, the atmosphere was heavy. Silence filled every corner, while Rosa cleaned as always, in a routine that seemed absurd to Marcos. But just as he thought of continuing to scold her, he heard a small sigh that broke the ice. His grandmother spoke to him, without anger, without reproach, just with a voice that seemed tired but firm. She asked him to go with her the next day, for there was something she had to show him. Curious and suspicious, Marcos agreed. Without knowing it, that simple act of obedience would mark the beginning of the deepest change in his life. Because sometimes the truth isn't in the words, but in the silences. And what Rosa had prepared for him was much more than an explanation. It was a legacy of courage, dedication, and love. It all began on a sunny morning, when Rosa took Marcos to the house of an elderly woman who lived alone in the neighborhood. While cleaning, Rosa confessed that decades ago, that very place was where she cared for and helped that woman when no one else could. That house had been a refuge not only for patients, but for broken families, and that she, without education or resources, had decided to make her sacrifice an act of kindness. Marcos began to doubt his own judgment. His grandmother not only cleaned, she supported lives with her calloused hands and her big heart. But why had she never told him any of this? Why had she kept it all silent? What he thought was humiliation was actually a shield to protect others. And to protect him, the following days were filled with meetings with people who, like Rosa, valued her not for her work, but for her soul. One after another, stories of gratitude, respect, and affection. And Marcos found himself inevitably trapped in an emotional roller coaster. Shame, pride, sadness, admiration. But above all, he felt small before the greatness of his grandmother. While he struggled against his prejudices, memories from his childhood emerged. The nights when Rosa tucked him in with her stories, when he was a barefoot child, full of dreams he didn't yet know how to handle. How was it possible that that love had now turned to contempt? He wondered if he himself had gotten lost in something that was more about fear of being judged than about reality. In a moment of confession, Rosa gave him an old letter kept in a drawer. The writing was faint, but each word spoke of immense sacrifice, giving up her own dreams, working tirelessly so that he could go to school, so that he could have a better life than she had. That was when Marcos understood that the grandmother he had despised was in fact his silent heroine. But the story doesn't end there, because when Marcos wanted to repair what he had broken, when he tried to get closer and ask for forgiveness, life showed him another unexpected turn. Rosa was ill, and the time to make amends was shorter than he thought. In the midst of that battle, Marcos had to face his own mistakes, his fears, and the possibility of losing forever the woman who had suffered silently so he could have a future. How could someone humiliate the one who gave them life and, at the same time, discover that this person is so much more than they thought? Marcos, in understanding that dignity cannot be measured by a job, but by the heart you put into it, changed his way of seeing the world. His story is a powerful reminder. Appearances are deceiving, and sometimes it's in the sacrifice of others where we find the lessons that truly define who we are. But there was one last question Marcos had to answer, one that would not only reveal the whole truth, but also test his resolve and commitment. Because when someone is humiliated and then discovers the greatness hidden behind that pain, the path to redemption is never easy. Would Marcos be willing to change forever, or would he fall back into the same mistake? That is the story that follows. And what happened next marked his life forever. Imagine you are in the schoolyard, surrounded by your friends. Everyone is laughing, telling stories about their families, while in the distance you notice your grandmother walking with tired steps, barely trying to hide the stains on her work clothes. That same grandmother who barely widens her pupils and wrinkles her face to smile at you, but whom you just can't help but hide from because who wants their friends to know that their grandmother cleans houses? Who wants them to see her picking up trash, sweeping floors, doing the work nobody wants to do? That was exactly how Marcos felt. Every time she came to pick him up from school, he pushed her a little further away. "Leave her outside," he would tell his friends. "I don't want them to see her, it's humiliating." And in front of them, there was no lack of insults, of cruel jokes. That feeling of shame that had sunk so deep it seemed impossible to remove. "My grandmother is a worker, but not just any worker. She cleans houses and I can't let anyone know that," he would think silently, though he never dared to say it out loud. But one day, something happened that would forever change that painful idea and that silent disdain. Marcos, tired of his mother's constant complaints that he needed to value his grandmother, let his own pride take over and decided to confront her harshly. He disrespected her in front of everyone, humiliated her mercilessly, and left with his friends, leaving his grandmother standing in the street, her head bowed and her heart in pieces. What he didn't know was that this same grandmother had been hiding a secret for years, a huge sacrifice she had silently made to protect her family. And that secret was about to come to light. That night, far from school, something strange happened. Marcos received a call on his cell phone. It was his mother, with a trembling voice and some tears held back that broke through with every word. "Your grandmother has been hiding something. Something you can't imagine. Something that could change everything." Marcos felt a lump in his throat, and a mix of fear and curiosity hit him at once. What could be so important as to justify her work and her struggle? Why had she never told him? For the first time, he felt there was more to that woman than the weak, tired figure he had despised for no reason. The next day, Marcos couldn't sleep. Every minute he replayed his mother's call in his mind. He decided to go to his grandmother's house unannounced. When he arrived, he found her in the kitchen sewing slowly, as if she were weaving magic with her hands. Her hands were full of calluses, but her gaze was strong and deep. She asked him to sit down, and without raising her voice or reproaching, she began to tell him a story Marcos had never heard before. She told him how, after her husband died unexpectedly, she was left alone with 3 small children and not a cent to her name. How she had to endure words, just like the ones now hurled at her by her grandchildren. How she cried in silence every night while cleaning houses, giving her all so those children could have a better future. She spoke of the time she skipped meals so that they wouldn't starve. Of the freezing nights when she couldn't heat the house because she didn't have money for electricity, and how her pride never let her give up. As she spoke, a tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek, and Marcos felt a shadow of guilt begin to choke him. Marcos wanted to ask more. He wanted to know what other secrets this woman, who built invisible walls to protect the whole family, was hiding. However, before he could, she looked him straight in the eyes and said something that left him frozen. "There's something I haven't told you. Something you need to understand before you ever judge me again." The room filled with tension, as if the truth was about to explode and forever change their relationship. But just then, his grandmother's cell phone started ringing insistently. She stood up and, without a word, answered it. Marcos heard her speaking in a low voice, almost in whispers, and then suddenly hang up. "That's why I work as a cleaner," she said, sitting back down with her head lowered. "What I do is only a part of what I've had to do. For reasons you can't imagine, life tested me and I chose to fight." That moment was a turning point for Marcos. He realized his grandmother was much more than a tired cleaner. She was a woman who, behind her invisible work, had made enormous and painful sacrifices. From that day on, Marcos never looked at her with those eyes of shame again. But the story was far from over, because just when he thought he had discovered everything, A forgotten childhood memory came back strongly to unravel an even greater mystery, a hidden letter, a family secret that could make everything he believed fall apart. The truth his grandmother kept could mark a before and after in his life and in the way he saw his own family. What could it be about? Why so much secrecy? Marcos was about to discover that his grandmother's humility hid the deepest and most powerful lesson about love, sacrifice, and courage. What happened next marked him forever. But not only that, it also changed the way those around him saw her. Because sometimes the greatest respect doesn't come from achievements, but from understanding the true cost of effort and dignity. And sometimes the bravest people are those who withstand the worst storms in silence, cleaning not just houses, but also the invisible wounds of those they love. If you thought you'd heard it all, wait until you discover what's behind that forgotten letter and the meaning of years of silence. Because this story is just beginning to reveal the true reason why a humble grandmother can become the invisible heroine of a family and the greatest lesson a grandson could ever receive. Do you want to know what happened next? Don't miss the next chapter, because what's coming will exceed any expectations and will forever change the way we see those we think we know. Have you ever felt that being ashamed of someone close to you could be your biggest mistake? Imagine a young man who humiliates his own grandmother in front of his friends because she works as a cleaner. But what he doesn't know, what no one imagines, is that this woman carries a secret that will change his entire perspective and mark his life forever. Carlos was always one of those boys who cared a lot about what others thought. In high school, his friends admired him. He was handsome, popular, and had a style that seemed perfect. But there was something he couldn't understand. His grandmother, Doña Teresa, spent many hours cleaning other people's houses. For Carlos, that was reason enough to feel ashamed. Who cares for someone like that? He thought, never realizing that behind every simple act lies a profound story. Like every Friday afternoon, they were in the village square, that place where voices blend and teasing spreads faster than rumors. Carlos couldn't hold back. His friends were joking about each other's lives, and when the topic of his grandmother came up, he let out a bitter laugh. "My grandma cleans houses, but it's nothing to brag about, huh?" he said loudly, while his friends laughed nervously, not knowing whether it was true or not. The worst was when, one day, right in front of his grandmother, he couldn't stop himself from making a hurtful comment. They were in the small kitchen at home, the one that was a refuge for her and a silent burden for him. "Why don't you find something better? Aren't you ashamed to go around picking up garbage, Grandma?" he said with disdain. Doña Teresa's gaze sank deep into his soul. She didn't respond. She just wiped away a tear she failed to hide. The tension hung in the air. For a moment, Carlos felt unstoppable. But maybe that was his gravest mistake. What no one knew, not even him, was that Teresa's sacrifice had begun years earlier, when she lost her son and was left alone with that rebellious grandson. She was willing to do anything so that Carlos could have a future she had never been able to reach. Every blanket she washed, every window she cleaned, was a piece of the puzzle that sustains a family. She never accepted help. She asked for nothing in return, because her love always took the form of effort and hidden tears. Then, one Friday, while Carlos was coming back from a party with his friends, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. His grandmother was there, on the train station platform, carefully lowering a heavy package. She was not the weak and tired woman he usually ignored. She had a firm, determined look that didn't match the image he had created in his mind. Without thinking, he wanted to approach her, to ask what she was doing, but the words caught in his throat. That same night, while going over his friend's messages, a video started to circulate in the group. It was his grandmother, working in one of the wealthiest houses in the neighborhood. But this time something was different. She wasn't just cleaning, she was also caring for a small child, consoling him, even reading him a story when she appeared tired. The video showed Teresa not as a mere worker, but as a kind soul, capable of far more than Carlos had ever wanted to see. Sitting in his room, Carlos remembered all the times he had despised his grandmother. He recalled his empty pride and that sting he felt every time she walked through the door. And he wondered, what would I have done if I were in her place? How did I never see all she did for me? The following days brought more surprises. He found out that Teresa went to church every morning without fail, not out of tradition, but to pray for her grandson's well-being. He learned that she secretly saved every penny she earned to pay for his university studies. And the most painful revelation came when he found an old notebook full of recipes and letters where Teresa wrote down every silent sacrifice, every renunciation made out of love. The young man began to understand that his words had been like daggers, and that this woman, whom he had publicly humiliated, carried a burden he could never imagine. For the first time, he felt a mix of guilt and hope, guilt for his selfishness and hope, because now he could change. But the story still had a deeper twist. An unexpected call from the principal of the school, where Teresa worked as a cleaner, would change the course of his life forever. The principal spoke with pride and admiration about how Teresa had helped a child with special needs, going beyond her job, with patience and unconditional love. Carlos, unable to believe it, began to open a door he had kept closed for years. And just when he thought his grandmother had sacrificed everything for him and now for others, one last revelation came. Grandmother Teresa had long hidden a talented past. In her youth, she was an excellent teacher, a brilliant woman who, due to tragic circumstances, lost everything and had to reinvent herself. That story, which had never come to light, was the true root of her strength. Carlos realized that his vision of the world was limited, selfish, and that his grandmother was a silent giant, building a legacy of love from the humblest places, from the most modest work. The humiliation he had made her endure was not just a mistake, but a deep wound he was willing to heal. At that moment, as the room filled with silence and reflection, Carlos promised he would never judge without knowing, and, above all, that he would honor the woman who, despite everything, never lost her dignity. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come from those we least expect. Now tell me, what would you do if you discovered that the person you thought insignificant is actually the hero of your life? The story of Carlos and Teresa is just beginning, but you already know that facing the truth can be more powerful than any shame. Only time will tell which path this young man will take and how life will make him understand that true love does not lie in appearances, but in invisible sacrifices. Do you want to keep listening to what happened next? I assure you, you can't imagine what's coming. There was nothing that embarrassed Javier more than his grandmother Carmen. Every time the old neighbors greeted her affectionately, he would look away, quicken his pace, and wish he could disappear. He couldn't understand how someone in his family could work cleaning houses, sweeping floors, and scrubbing bathrooms to make a living. To him, that was humiliating. And when he was with his friends, that feeling turned into an unbearable burden. That's why one day, in the park where they used to hang out, he didn't hesitate to make fun of her in front of everyone. Did you see my grandma? She works cleaning houses. An old lady with a broom and a rag? Horrible, he said loudly with a nervous laugh, hoping his friends would back him up. But instead of hearing laughter, his friends looked at him confused, a bit uncomfortable, and quickly changed the subject. Javier felt a chill in his stomach, but disguised it with a bitter smile. He didn't want to show he was hurt, even though the shame he felt for her was already eating him up inside. What Javier didn't know was that the grandmother he despised had a life he had never seen, secrets hidden behind those rough hands and those simple clothes. Carmen didn't just clean houses to survive. She carried a sacrifice that no young person could imagine. Not even with all the empty words Javier let loose into the air. That Sunday, after having humiliated Carmen in front of his friends, Javier came home exhausted, a mix of anger and guilt fluttering in his chest. He found his grandmother sitting in the kitchen, as always, her worn hands on the table and her eyes full of an inexplicable serenity. For the first time in a long while, Javier was left speechless. This brief, silent encounter would be the prelude to everything that was yet to come. That night, Javier woke up to a strange noise. He went downstairs and found Carmen handling some old boxes in the basement. She had stayed up late, going through things from the past. He didn't want to interrupt, but curiosity got the better of him. "What are you doing, Grandma?" he asked in a tired voice, with a hint of annoyance. She looked at him and, hiding nothing, began to tell him a story he didn't expect. A story about sacrifice, invisible struggles, and a love that had sustained their whole family since before he was born. Carmen recalled how she had to work hard since she was a girl, so that her children could study and get ahead, so that they would never lack a roof or a hot meal. Despite having had no education or opportunities herself, as he listened, Javier felt his world slowly falling apart. Each word from his grandmother was like a blow against his arrogance, but the hardest part was yet to come. Carmen confessed that cleaning houses wasn't just a way to make a living, but a deliberate sacrifice she made to help them through a dark time he didn't even know about: his mother's illness, the fight to save her, and the huge debt Carmen had taken on without anyone knowing, so that Javier could study and dream of a different future. At that very moment, something changed in Javier forever. His shame turned into an indescribable weight on his chest, a pain he didn't know how to ease. He sat beside his grandmother and took her hand, tears he didn't dare show threatening to fall, but still raining in silence. From that day on, nothing was ever the same again. Javier began to see his grandmother with new eyes, understanding that behind every day of cleaning there was a giant sacrifice, a vast and invisible love. And just when he thought he'd uncovered the whole truth, Carmen revealed something more, a deeper secret that made him confront his own arrogance and redefine who he was and who he could become. This young man, deeply marked by that revelation, set out on a path nobody could have anticipated. Because sometimes the truth our elders hold can be the harshest lesson and the most beautiful one. But wait, what was that secret he still didn't know? What had Carmen done in those houses she cleaned that went beyond what was visible? And most importantly, what was Javier willing to do to make up for the harm he'd caused? What happened next changed his life, and maybe yours too, forever. Because sometimes humiliating the person you least expect can lead you to the greatest humiliation, facing your own ignorance and regret. So stay tuned, because this is just beginning. The story of Javier and his grandmother is not just about pride or shame. It's about the true value of love, sacrifice, and forgiveness. And what happened after all this, I assure you, is something that will change how you see your family and those who fight silently for you. It's not just any story. It's a lesson we all need to learn. And Javier, without realizing it, was about to discover it in the most powerful way possible. Don't miss a detail, because what follows will not leave you indifferent. I never thought that day would mark a before and after in my life. I was with my friends laughing when she appeared. My grandmother, with her dry hands and tired smile, coming out of that big house we rented to clean. At that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected, pure and simple shame. Why did it have to be my grandmother who cleaned? Why couldn't it be someone else? My friends looked at her the same way I did, with a strange mix of pity and contempt, but I couldn't stand it. I pointed at her sarcastically, making fun of her without thinking twice. What's she doing there? Still working as a cleaner? I thought with the money we have, she didn't need to get her hands dirty, I said. With a knot in my throat I didn't know how to explain. She lowered her head, her eyes shining with that look that's a mix of sadness and pride, but she said nothing. My friends let out some awkward laughs and changed the subject, as if they wanted to erase that scene. But I couldn't forget those words, or her expression, or the heavy silence that hung between us. That was when I decided to distance myself, pretending I didn't know that woman everyone saw as just a cleaner. Inside, I was completely shattered, though I would never admit it. That humiliation had a colossal effect beyond what I could imagine. The following days were a whirlwind. I tried to avoid my grandmother, justified my absences with silly excuses, and sank deeper into that damned sense of superiority I had created myself. Every time I saw my friends, that improvised dinner, that easy joke, I used her image to feel better about myself. But the reality was different. Something inside me was breaking little by little. Why did I feel so bad and yet so arrogant at the same time? Why did shame devour me and make me act like such an idiot? Every time I remember those moments, I realize that I hadn't just humiliated her, but myself, our story, our family. But what happened next was something I never imagined. One afternoon, while returning from college, I saw a sign in the window of a cafe that read, "Help wanted for community project." Curiosity got the best of me, and without thinking much, I went closer. There, among the photos and stories that decorated the place, I found something that froze me in my tracks. A wall dedicated to my grandmother with letters, clippings, and testimonies speaking of the incredible work she had done, helping families in difficult situations, cleaning houses not out of obligation, but to fund medical treatments for sick children in her neighborhood. My heart clenched at once. How could it be that I, who had looked down on her so much, didn't know any of this? How had I been so blind all this time? I decided to get closer to that place to understand more. As I entered, an older woman with warm eyes and a calm voice greeted me kindly. "Are you looking for Marta?" she asked. "Yes, she's my grandmother," I answered with a trembling voice. Then slowly, the woman told me the story my grandmother had carried in silence and with so much effort. She's spent years sacrificing her time and health to help those nobody else sees. She's not just a cleaner, she's a silent hero. It was a direct blow to my soul. I started to remember moments I had ignored. How she would prepare dinner for me in secret when I wasn't around. How she worked hard to fix my clothes so I wouldn't be embarrassed. How she fought through a whole day's fatigue just to smile at me before bed. That night I couldn't sleep. The pieces were starting to fit together in my mind in a painful way. She had lived a life I had never wanted to see. A life I had destroyed with hurtful words. I felt guilty, but I was also afraid. How could I make up for so much damage? Would I be capable of asking for forgiveness after everything? Pride seemed like an insurmountable barrier, although remorse was stronger than ever. Something inside me changed forever from that moment on. The next day, I returned home with the firm decision to face the truth, even though I feared my grandmother's reaction. When I saw her arrive, tired but with the same smile I will always keep in my memory, I felt my words get stuck in my throat. I didn't know how to begin, didn't want to hurt her again, but I needed to explain everything I had felt and discovered. She looked at me with her wise eyes, as if she already knew what I was going through. Without needing any questions, she gave me a hug that wasn't just consolation, but also forgiveness. In that hug, I understood that what held my family together was much stronger than any silly prejudice or passing shame. From that day on, everything started to change. I began accompanying her at work, seeing her effort up close, understanding that dignity I had ignored. I learned that value isn't found in the clothes you wear or the job you have, but in honesty, dedication, and the strength to keep going no matter what. My friends noticed the change. Some laughed, others drifted away, but I didn't care much. The only thing I wanted was to redeem all the harm I had done, though I knew that some of that pain would remain forever. This story doesn't end here. There are still secrets to reveal and decisions that will test what family, respect, and love really mean. Because sometimes shame and humiliation are only the prelude to a profound lesson that changes your life forever. And I'm ready to show you everything I discovered so that no one else makes my same mistake. But beware, because the true story is just beginning, and what's coming will touch nerves no one expects. Do you want to know what happened next? Don't miss the next chapter, where you'll discover my grandmother's hidden sacrifice and how that truth could change everything. From the moment Daniel crossed the door with his friends, a mix of nerves and pride churned inside him. But it wasn't the usual excitement of just any young man. It was the kind of pride you feel when you're about to show off something you believe makes you stand out, even though in reality, it only condemns you. He knew his friends judged him, that they measured his worth not by who he was, but by who his family members were. And for them, having a grandmother working as a cleaner was a reason for ridicule. Far from protecting her, Daniel became her harshest judge. That afternoon, as his friends gathered around him in the neighborhood square, Daniel didn't hesitate to mock his grandmother. "Is she really coming?" he said, laughing under his breath, with a cruel gleam in his eye that he could barely hide. "Yeah, my grandma cleans houses. It's no big deal, but—" And he let out an awkward laugh, as if that tiny detail contained all his supposed superiority. Yet his words echoed painfully within him, in a way much deeper than it seemed. It wasn't just shame. It was fear. A fear hiding in the shadow of his own prejudices and in the desperate desire to fit in. He had too much to lose if his friends ever found out the truth about his home, about the silent sacrifice his grandmother made every day when she left at dawn, came back tired, washed his clothes, healed his wounds with gentle words, and never asked for anything in return. But that afternoon, the cold words and the teasing not only hurt his grandmother, they also marked a turning point for Daniel, because a simple act put on to impress others would open a wound no one saw coming. And that wound would start to bleed when his grandmother decided to let him see a part of her life she'd always kept secret. The story Daniel had ignored came as a blow of reality, opening doors he never even knew existed. In the profound loneliness of the house, when there were no more masks or fake laughter, his grandmother showed him something he had never imagined: photos, documents and letters that spoke of a glorious past, of a life full of broken dreams, of a lost love and an unbroken dignity. Daniel was left breathless as he heard how this woman, whom he had humiliated in front of his friends, had suffered more than anyone he knew. She wasn't just a cleaner. She was a survivor, a heroine who sacrificed her own comfort so he could have a better future. Every step she took with the broom was a battle to keep her family afloat. Every day she rose early was a silent act of love. He couldn't help but wonder why he, who had every reason to be compassionate and brave, had been so cruel and selfish. Why had he reduced his grandmother to a mere domestic help, when in reality she was the rock that held them all together? That confusion weighed down on his chest as his remorse grew bigger and harder to ignore. The revelation unleashed a storm of emotions. Anger toward himself, the sorrow of having judged her without truly knowing her, and above all, the urgent need to make amends. Yet Daniel also began to understand something else, that dignity doesn't depend on the opinion of others, but on respecting and honoring those who fight for you in silence. That greatness doesn't always come in the form of social success, but in the invisible strength with which someone loves and protects. It wasn't easy. Their relationship was fractured by years of silence and unspoken reproaches. But those dark nights, when Daniel listened closely to his grandmother's stories, also became fertile ground for forgiveness and healing. She bore no grudge. She just wanted him to understand that her struggle wasn't for herself, but so her family could have a different path. His grandmother then explained how she had to give up her own dreams to be a mother, to hold her home together when life seemed to fall apart. She told him that cleaning houses wasn't a humiliation, but an act of dignity, because she chose that work over the indecency of leaving her grandson without a future. That silent sacrifice was her way of standing tall in a world that so often judges without seeing. Daniel felt a huge weight lift from his soul. He began to see his grandmother, not through the eyes of judgment, but with respect and profound gratitude. In the midst of that darkness, he discovered a light that would mark him forever. The truth could no longer be hidden behind lies or whispers, but just when he thought everything was about to change for the better, Something happened that put his character and what he had learned to the test once again. An unexpected event, a decision that only someone who has learned to value the power of sacrifice can make. And that decision would not only show him who he truly was, but also define his future, because sometimes the most powerful and transformative stories are born at the very moment when pride breaks and love takes the reins. Daniel was about to discover that true greatness lies in being able to face what you once ignored, and then acting without hesitation to heal what you have injured. The grandmother he had once humiliated was the clearest mirror he needed to grow, and though the path of reconciliation was only beginning, nothing could ever be the same. That afternoon, when his world collapsed before the truth, was also the spark that ignited the flame of change. Are you ready to find out how Daniel's life took an unexpected turn? What lessons did he discover, and what actions transformed him from the inside out? Then come along, because this story is just beginning, and what happens next will make you question many things about value, family, and the true meaning of dignity. Not everything is what it seems, and sometimes the person you least expect bears the heaviest burden of all. The truth behind that grandmother's sacrifice will forever change Daniel's life, and maybe the lives of many others. Don't miss it. He never imagined how much he was going to learn that night. He had barely left class when his friends started joking about his grandmother. Your grandma? The one who cleans houses. That sounds weird, bro. The mocking voice echoed down the hallway. Carlos felt a wave of shame rise up in his throat. He tried to hide it, lowering his gaze, but couldn't stop himself from letting out a hurtful comment, louder than he meant. Yes, it's true. She cleans houses. I don't know how she can stand that life. His friend's laughter was like a whip, hurting more than he expected. It wasn't just shame, it was fear. Fear that something about his family made him less. Fear of losing the respect he had always needed. When he got home, the silence was almost unbearable. His grandmother, as always, was in the kitchen, her hands on that old wooden board he had seen her clean in 1,000 different ways over the years. He looked at her, not knowing what to say, his heart tight. She smiled, sweet and tired, as if she hadn't heard a thing at school. Carlos locked himself in his room, trying to drown out that guilt already burning his chest. Why couldn't he feel proud of the woman who raised him? Why did the simple fact that she cleaned for a living seem like something to be ashamed of? That night, his grandmother's story began to seep into his mind, like a secret no one had ever told him. Where did she come from? What had she left behind to be there in that humble kitchen, making dinner for them? Carlos had no answers, only questions that tormented him. The next morning, he decided he needed to know more. He approached his grandmother with a mix of fear and shame. "Grandma, why do you clean houses? Aren't you embarrassed? My friends make fun of you." The look he got back was infinite, deep, like a sea of untold stories. She said nothing at first, only invited him to sit beside her, something unusual for her. Carlos sensed that something huge was about to be revealed. With a steady voice, she began to tell her story, but not the one he expected. She spoke of a past full of sacrifices, of struggle, of losing what mattered most to give Carlos a life without deprivation. "When your mom and you were little, we lost everything in that fire," she said with a sigh that seemed to carry centuries. "We had nowhere to go, nothing but love. I couldn't wait for help from anyone, so I started working cleaning houses. It was my way of building a roof for us, of saving us from being forgotten." Carlos could barely believe it. This woman, he saw as simple and humble, had carried an unimaginable weight. "I never told you any of this because I wanted you to have a better life, to never feel lesser because of my work. I wanted you to focus on your dreams, not our hardships." His grandmother's voice held a mix of pride and sadness that made Carlos lower his gaze, feeling for the first time an intense blend of respect, sorrow, and love. How could he have been so blind? How could he forget that she had built everything for him? The next day, Carlos woke up with new energy. He walked to school thinking of his grandmother, of the hands he had so often looked down on and now saw filled with incredible strength. He felt he had to do something, that what had happened needed to mean more than just quietly crying. He decided that instead of hiding, he would share the story now living in his heart. But he couldn't help wondering, what if someone doesn't understand? What if the world still sees his grandmother as something less? The opportunity came as soon as they entered class. The teacher asked them to talk about personal heroes. His classmates began giving examples straight out of books. Famous athletes, movie characters, celebrities. For a moment, Carlos hesitated. But then, with a voice that sounded strange even to himself, he started to talk about what he had kept hidden until then. He spoke of sacrifice, of silent love, of those long hours cleaning houses so he wouldn't miss class, so he wouldn't feel fear or shame. As he spoke, he noticed some classmates looking at him differently, some in surprise, others with admiration. Because a hero's strength is not in their shoes, but in the story behind every step. That afternoon, when he got home, his grandmother was waiting for him with the same calm gaze. Carlos hugged her without saying a word. In that embrace was a silent promise. He would no longer hide her, would not judge her. For the first time he understood what true pride meant. But deep down, something else had awakened. The desire to make peace with a past that had marked them both, and to build together a different story, one without shame or silence. Just when it seemed the storm was beginning to subside, an unexpected call came. On the other end of the line, a serious voice told him there was an opportunity for his grandmother to enter a special support program for domestic workers, a program that would change both their lives even more. But there was a condition. She could only accept if Carlos was willing to step forward. Now his pride was no longer just personal. It was a battle that would make him question everything. Because, what are you willing to sacrifice when you face the truth? How do you deal with humiliation when you know you're right? Carlos stared at the phone, his palms sweating and his heart about to burst. He remembered every word spoken, every silence in the house, every uneasy glance with his friends. He knew that the path to genuine regret and reconciliation would not be easy. He knew this story was just beginning, and that what happened next would mark him forever, just like the title of the story no one would ever forget. He humiliated his grandmother for working as a cleaner, and what happened next marked him forever. But what exactly had happened? What secrets were about to come to light? The only sure thing was that Carlos would never be the same. And you, are you ready to discover what nobody has told yet? This is much more than a story of pride and shame. It is the truth that shakes our own convictions. So stay tuned, because what follows will make you think twice before judging those who truly fight for love. Have you ever felt so ashamed of someone that you didn't even want others to know about it? That's what happened to Marcos with his own grandmother. In front of his friends, one day he just couldn't hold it in anymore. He saw her sweeping the floor, cleaning windows, tidying up a neighbor's house, and he would only think, why doesn't she do something better? Why risk them judging me for having that woman in my life? That's how it all started. What seemed like simple teenage embarrassment became a chasm that separated him from the one he should love the most. But what Marcos didn't know was that the same woman he despised was carrying a secret that would change his life forever. And we were only just beginning to understand it. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about pride or humiliation. It's about the weight of appearances, the wounds you inflict on yourself, and how unexpected it can be to forgive when the truth comes to light. Marcos thought his grandmother was just someone ordinary, someone who needed to be hidden. But there was so much more inside her. There are moments in life when you think you know people, but they surprise you in the hardest way, on the stage you least expect it. Today, you're going to join Marcos on one of those journeys, where the world turns upside down, and you'll understand why not everything is as it seems at first glance. Marcos was 19 years old, finishing high school and dreaming of a different life. He'd arrive at school on his motorcycle, surrounded by party-loving friends with bulletproof confidence. His grandmother, Rosa, lived with him and his mom in a modest apartment, but for Marcos, Rosa was a nuisance. He didn't like people seeing her as the cleaner of the neighborhood. His friends, always picking up on those details, fed into that humiliation without him noticing. He had forgotten that Rosa had raised his mother, that she had fought during hard times without complaint. That rainy day, when his friends came over and saw Rosa cleaning the floor with meticulous movements, Marcos couldn't take it anymore. "Grandma, could you not do that when my friends are here?" "It's embarrassing," he snapped harshly. Rosa looked at him sadly, saying nothing. But there was something in her eyes that marked Marcos, something he couldn't understand yet. Weeks went by, and the tension only grew. Marcos avoided Rosa, barely spoke to her. His friends began to tease him more, and he, to protect his image, fell into a toxic cycle of contempt and resentment. But amid all that noise, a small glimmer appeared. One day, unintentionally, Marcos found a letter among Rosa's things. He shouldn't have done it, but curiosity got the better of him. The letter was addressed to someone named Miguel, his grandfather, who had passed away years before. In that letter, Rosa spoke of sacrifices, of secrets kept to avoid ruining a dream, and of something she had done to keep the family together before Marcos was even born. Marcos's expression changed. That grandmother he had humiliated had a story he didn't know, one that could transform everything he believed. But what was that sacrifice? And why did Rosa keep it so painfully secret? The last week before graduation was approaching, and Marcos felt that something was about to explode. The mix of guilt and confusion kept him awake at night. He barely trusted his friends anymore, but he didn't know how to face Rosa either. The only thing certain was that his contempt was consuming him. Meanwhile, Rosa kept working as a cleaner, quiet and determined, as if nothing was happening. He didn't imagine that at the same time, the truth his grandmother was guarding would not only change their relationship, but also teach him a lesson that would mark his life forever. Only one question remained in the air. What was Marcos willing to do when he finally learned the whole truth? And that's where this story stays, right at the moment where everything can change. Will Marcos keep his pride, or will he be able to face the truth with everything that implies? Don't go away, because what's coming is more shocking than you can imagine.